Hey, what's up everybody? I'd like to welcome you to another JUCE tutorial. And in this tutorial, we're going to talk a little bit about code refactoring and passing data between classes. So at the moment, if you've been following along with our Build a Sampler VST series, you'll currently have all of your code jammed in between the plugin editor and plugin processor. And really what we would like to do is have separate classes that are each doing one individual job. And the reason that we like to do this is because if we want to do a project in the future where we need a wave thumbnail or where we need an ADSR envelope, we want to have our code where it's modular and reusable and we can use it in future projects. So what we have here is the end result when we finish this tutorial. We have our wave thumbnail that's going to be in the center of the screen, and we can drag our file in and it'll display the file name. And as you can see, we've also done a little bit of customization on the wave colors. And then we also have our ADSR, which is going to be in its own class as well. Before we get started, if you'd like to support the audio programmer, be sure to do so on patreon.com/theaudioprogrammer, and be sure to give a thumbs up and subscribe if you find this video useful. Let's get started. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my producer and I'm going to add a class for my waveform thumbnail. This is going to be a component class because this is going to be a visual element on my UI. So that's why I'm going to do it as a component class rather than just a regular CPP and header file. The component class is essentially any sort of visual element in JUCE. I'll just call this wave thumbnail. Now I'll create the source files. I'll just move these down. And now I can save and open in my IDE, and here we are. So as we can see, when we created those files, we have some basic functions that are set up for us. So we have a paint function and a constructor. So this is for our visualization. Now what we need to do is we need to take the functionality that we currently have for the wave thumbnail, and we need to start moving it over to our actual class. So all of this is our drawing behavior when we're actually drawing the waveform itself. Just going to take this all, I'm going to cut it, and I'm going to paste it in the paint function of our wave thumbnail class. We're going to get all kinds of errors because we don't have any of these variables anymore, such as should be painting or M audio points. So we need to move those now as well. Another thing that we'll notice is that we have this processor.get waveform, which we were using our processor from our plugin processor. We had a reference to it that we had in the editor, and we don't have a reference to our processor anymore. So we need to find a way to give access to the processor in our wave thumbnail class. So what I'll do is I will first go back into the editor, and I'm going to take this include plugin processor header file, and now I'm going to include it in the wave thumbnail class. Now what I can do is I can create a reference. It's called hello sampler audio processor. And remember, this is a reference. We're not making a copy of it. We're just making a reference. So we're actually referring to the plugin processor that's been created for us here. Because we are referring to another processor, we're not actually creating a processor in this wave thumbnail class, then what we have to do is we have to tell this reference what processor we're actually talking about. So because of this, the way that we do this, and this is one of the key things that I wanted to outline for this tutorial, we need to actually pass in the processor that we're referring to into our wave thumbnail constructor. Okay, so if you look at your plugin editor, you'll see that we have the constructor for the plugin editor, and then you'll see that we have a reference to a hello sampler audio processor. when we actually go into the CPP file, you'll see in the initializer list that what happens is that when the hello sampler audio processor editor gets initialized, it has to give a reference to a processor. Then what we do is we have this pattern where what we say is the reference to the processor that we're referring to is this processor that we're passing in as an argument. So we're saying, okay, we have a reference to a processor. What processor are we talking about? We're talking about this P. Okay, and let me see if I can show you where that happens at in the plugin processor itself. And we see that what happens is that when the hello sampler audio processor editor is instantiated in our plugin processor, it passes in this argument, which means that it's passing in a plugin processor. So that's how that data gets passed from one place to another. It gets instantiated in the audio processor itself, and then it creates a new audio processor editor where it passes in itself as the argument. Then what happens is when we're in the editor, then when the editor is instantiated, then it basically passes the data onto the processor, and it's saying, hey, processor reference that we've just created, you're referring to the processor that's being passed in as this argument. Okay, so now we're just doing the same thing, but we're doing it with wave thumbnail. Okay, so what we need to do is we need to give it access to the plugin processor that we're creating. So we've already included our plugin processor class. We've already created a reference to our processor. And now all we need to do is we need to be able to pass that in as an argument. So I'm going to create an argument in the constructor of hello sampler audio processor reference. In the constructor, I'm using the argument to the processor. And then what I'm doing is I'm telling this processor reference that I created in wave thumbnail that the processor that I want to use is the one that I pass in as an argument. So that's why I put a P here. Okay. Now what we needed to do is work the data back up the chain. So if you think of the editor kind of as the parent of wave thumbnail, so the editor we could think of it roughly as the background component. Okay, so you think of it as the whole background that the user sees. And now it's going to contain these various elements such as the ADSR and the wave thumbnail. And now what we need to do is we want to create a wave thumbnail object. So we've already included we haven't actually. So the first thing we need to do is we need to include wave thumbnail.h. And now what we want to do is we want to create an object of wave thumbnail. And I'll call it wave thumbnail. And now this is where we get to the part where I was talking about passing around the data. So we go into our plugin editor.cpp. We have this constructor. The constructor is instantiated when the editor is created. And now what I need to do is I need to once again pass on the data, because remember I have the wave thumbnail, and now it needs to know what processor I need to pass into it. And that's where I do this. I do this in this, what they call an initialization list. So what I need to do is I say, hey, wave thumbnail, the processor, you need a processor argument, and I'm going to pass in that processor now. Okay. And that comes from here. Okay. So I'm just going to go through that one more time for people that are just starting. Okay. So the plugin processor is created first. And when the plugin processor is instantiated, it creates an editor. So the processor creates the editor. And we can see that here in this function called create editor. And we say, okay, we're creating a new audio processor editor, and I'm passing in a this argument. Okay, this refers to an instantiation of itself, of its own class, the plugin processor class. Now going back to plugin editor, we can think of plugin editor once again as the parent of all UI components. So any UI components should eventually kind of flow into the plugin editor. And when we're doing this, so we have this wave thumbnail that we've created. And now what we're doing is we're just passing the data back down to wave thumbnail, because in wave thumbnail, in our paint function, we need access so we can actually paint the waveform later on in the thumbnail class. So that's the reason why we need to have access to the processor. So now those errors have cleared up, and now we need to move on. So now we're going to start looking at how we can actually draw the wave thumbnail in the editor. So the first thing we need to do, since it's a child component of plugin editor, we first need to make it visible to the editor. So we can use the add and make visible function. And in here, we just put the wave thumbnail. Now what I could do is I can actually set it up in the resized function. So what we'll do is we'll get rid of this commented out code. And what I could say is wave thumbnail, and I'll use the set bounds relative call here. And these are numbers that I've already kind of picked out through testing. So we'll start with 0.0. So we want it to start all the way at the left on the x-axis. And we will go down a quarter of the screen on the y-axis. And then we want this to go all the way across the screen on the x-axis. So that's how wide we want it to be. And we'll make it about half of the full UI's width. Okay. And that's how we're going to do that. If we go back to our wave thumbnail class, now we can start to do a little bit of customization. So at the moment, the background is just black. So we won't actually see the wave thumbnail as being separate from the rest of our editor. So first thing that we'll do is we'll paint it a different color. So we'll do g.fill all. I'm going to need to use colors, and this time I'll use cadet blue, and you can actually add another argument on here to make it brighter or darker. And in this case, I'll actually make it darker. So let's just see what we have at this point, see if we can get some basic functionality coming out of this plugin. We may have some errors. So at the moment, we have this M should be painting, and we need to make sure that we actually have that in our class. We do. Oh, this is actually in our editor. So don't forget that our functionality for actually dragging into the waveform, dragging files into the waveform, is actually still in our editor. So we need to actually take all of this. So this is whether all of our drag and drop functionality, and we actually need to put this into our wave thumbnail class now. And now that we've done that, we need to do a couple other things just to make it work. First thing is that this isn't in the Hello Sampler Audio Processor Editor anymore. We're now in the Wave Thumbnail class. So now I need to correct that. And now I need to add these functions to my header file in Wave Thumbnail. So I can just cut them out of my editor. And I will just place them here. And then we're going to get another error which is going to be that we were using file drag and drop target, and we were inheriting from this class to give us our actual drag and drop functionality, but we don't need that there anymore. We need it in our wave thumbnail class because that's where we're actually doing our drag and drop. So now we need to use the component class or the wave thumbnail class, and now we're going to inherit file drag and drop target, because these two functions were actually overriding from file drag and drop target. So now let's see if this will build. Okay, we're building successfully. And by the way, if you're having trouble on any of these things or trouble understanding, be sure to leave a comment below, or you can join the Audio Programmer Discord group where we all help each other out and answer each other's questions. The link will be in the description. So now we can load up our plugin. And here we are at the moment. And now I'm just going to drag a file in there, see if it actually drags in. And it drags in. As we can see, we are dragging in and it's not currently displaying properly. Okay. What we could do is we want to go back and have a look at it, but we'll see another problem as well. So I'll play the file. Let me turn it down a little bit. And then if I tap on the ADSR, we'll see something else. We'll see that the file actually, the waveform actually disappears. Okay, so we need to have a look at that. So let's go back. So the first thing that we'll look at is the reason why the thumbnail is displaying strangely. Okay, and we'll go into the graphics class, and we need to have a look and see where we're at. Okay, so I can identify what the problem is here. In our JMap, what we've done is we're taking all of our audio points, and we're saying, okay, all of these audio points that are coming in are in between -1 and 1, and we want those to map out on our UI between 200 and 0. Okay, so we have this kind of what they call a magic number. Okay, so and that's not what we want. What we want to have here is we want to have get height. Okay, because what we want there is we want to be able to scale this up and down no matter what the height and width of our UI is. And if we do that, we should be able to see a change immediately. So let's go ahead and try it again. So we should try to use numbers that are dynamic, like get height, as much as possible. And hopefully this will display properly now. And we see that it does indeed display properly in the middle as we wanted it to. We see that it still disappears, right? So let's have a look at what we need to do there. So now what we see is that we have this Boolean should be painting that turns to true when the file is dragged on it. So it paints our file once. And then what happens is that should be painting then turns to false. And because it turns to false, then it's not painting this anymore. Okay. The reason that we added this should be painting flag was to sense when the actual file was actually being dropped. But what we could do this in a more effective way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of this flag completely. And instead, what we could do is we could take this waveform. So this gives us access to the waveform. So we can actually find out if we can find out information about the waveform once it's been dragged onto our component. So we could say we want to get the waveform, and now we could just make a simple rule that if waveform get num samples is greater than 0, so we know that if there is a waveform on there, that the number of samples will be greater than 0. And if that happens, then we can continue to paint on our waveform. So let's go ahead and try that out. Now I'm going to drag it on here. Now I'm going to move the ADSR. And now we can see that we moved the ADSR, we clicked on another part of the screen, but the waveform is still painting, okay, because that's painting continuously. So that's great. Now we just want to make the UI a little bit bigger so we can actually start fitting our ADSR on the UI sensibly. So I'm going to go to my editor, which is the main UI class. And at the moment it's 600 by 200. I'll just make this 600 by 400. And now let's make a few other improvements to the wave thumbnail class. So we'll go back to wave thumbnail. One improvement that we can make is, what if we wanted to have the file name of the file that you dragged and dropped onto the component to display on the wave thumbnail itself? First thing that we need to do is actually have a look at the point where we're actually getting the file. So as you can see, we have these two functions called isInterested in file drag, where we're looking to see if it's a .wave or a .mp3, so on. And we have this function called files dropped, where we're actually loading the file. And this would be a logical point for us to actually grab the file name and look for a way to pass it on to paint on our UI. When we're actually dropping something onto the thumbnail, it's giving us a string array of file names. And I'm sure that there's a really clever way that we could actually just take the file extension off and look for the last backslash. But luckily there's a easier way that we could do this. So we have this string, which is the absolute path of the file. Now what I'm going to do, the way I'm going to approach this, is I'm actually going to create a file object, a file unique pointer. And what we can do is we can actually create a file using an absolute path from the string. So what I could do is I'll create a object on the heap. So this will destroy and free up the memory once it goes out of scope. So we could say auto my file equals std unique pointer, and this will be of type file. And then in here, I just need to put the argument, which will be the string that is file. So we have the string array called files, and then we're iterating through and we're saying for all the files, all the strings in this group of string arrays called files, and this needs to be make unique. Because what we're doing is we're actually allocating this in one go. I'm just going to type this all again so it doesn't confuse anybody. Make unique, it's a type file, and then in here we're just putting file as our argument. So that is creating a file pointer. And now all I can do is I can say my file. Then we use the arrow operator because it's a pointer. And then I could use this function called get file name without extension, and that returns a string. Now I just need a member variable so I can actually pass this string into somewhere where I can actually use it in Paint and actually draw the text to the screen. So I will create a string and I will call this file name. It's good to initialize these. And now I can set mfile name to equal this file name without extension. Now it's just a matter of actually drawing this in the paint method. So what we could do is we could set the color, and we'll say colors, we'll set it to white. We'll set a font size. Let's set it to maybe 15. And we can use a function called fitted text. Here we can put our file name as the string for the first argument. Then we need the area that we want to actually paint this in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a quick rectangle of the actual bounds of this component by saying auto bounds equals get local bounds. I'm going to use a argument called reduced. So what this is going to do is this is just going to give me a little margin inside the actual rectangle. So it'll make a rectangle that's actually a little bit smaller than the local, than the bounds of the actual thumbnail. I'll just reduce it by, let's say, 10 pixels on all sides. The reason I'm doing that is so that when I'm actually drawing this, I'm not drawing it to the absolute edge of the screen. If I want to do it, if I want to draw it to the right and I don't put a margin there, it'll go all the way to the very right and go right to the edge. I just want to have a little bit of a margin. Makes it look a little bit neater. So I'm not actually going to call this bounds. I'll call this text bounds. Normally, because normally I have bounds equaling just the local bounds normally. So and now I need this rectangle object, text bounds. I'll put it in the top right. So you can just say justification, top right. Then you can put the number of lines that you want this text to be, and I'll make it one line. So there we go. I'll also take the waveform. So the waveform was painting black. I'm going to change that. Let's make it yellow. So what we have is we have the subpath that starts here, and then we actually complete the path down at the bottom. So this seems like a natural place for us to set the color. So we'll set the color to yellow. And let's see if that will work. Now we'll drag in a sample. And we see that the sample name now displays at the top right. And that looks pretty good. We also have the waveform displaying in yellow now. So now the only other thing that we would like to do is have some sort of text to let the user know to drop a file into that space if they want to load an audio file. Otherwise, the user wouldn't know to drag that file in. So what we'll do is we'll go back out, and so we have this if statement saying if we have a waveform loaded, essentially, then do all of the drawing. We're going to put an else here, and we will set the color to white. We will set the font size to, let's say, 40. And then we will do drawing the fitted text. I'm going to put it in the center so we don't need to worry about it bleeding into the edge of our bounds. So I will say drop an audio file to load, and the areas get local bounds, which is going to be the whole size of our whole component. I'm going to put this in the center so we don't need to worry about the margin. And we will make this one line. So let's just test that out very quickly. And this should be everything for now. And we will move on soon to the ADSR. So there we go. Drag an audio file to load. Now it should disappear and draw the waveform, and it does that. So that's working properly. Now let's move on and put the ADSR in its own class. So here we are back in our producer, and I will create an ADSR class. We'll make it a new component class since it's going to be a visual element. I'll call it ADSR component. I won't call it ADSR because JUCE already has an ADSR class. Now, I'll take this and I'll drag it to the bottom. And now we'll open it up in the IDE. So this is a pretty good review of essentially what we did earlier, where we were passing around the reference to our processor. So now all we need to do is we need to take all of our sliders and labels from our ADSR, and now we will just move this data over to our ADSR class. So now we go back to our editor. We have all of this business where we're actually drawing the sliders. And I'm just going to cut all of that. And you see how it really cleans up the editor. The editor should be pretty clean when you actually are doing this properly. I say properly, I'm very subjective. I like to have my editor very clean. And as you can see, we get another error message because we don't have our processor anymore. So we have to get that back again. So once again, I will take my plugin processor and I will make sure I include it in the header. And now I'm going to create a reference to it. And now I need to make sure that I pass that in my constructor. So I'm just going to grab the name of it here. And I need to do that in my CPP as well. And once again, we need to use the initializer list to pass the reference to our actual processor variable. So we're letting this processor reference know that we're talking about the processor that we're passing into the ADSR component. And now we need to go back to the editor. We need to include ADSR component now. We need to create an object. I'll call this MADSR. I'm going to get rid of this text button because we don't need that anymore. These can go away now as well. And now we need to actually use our initializer list to actually initialize the ADSR. Once again, we're just using the processor that we're passing into the editor. So it's just passing the data right back down to the subclasses. And now I just need to add and make it visible to my editor. And now I'm going to make it visible on the screen with my resized function. Oh, we forgot to pass some data over here. So I'm going to do that in just a second. So we will say MADSR. Once again, we'll use set bounds relative. And these are just some values that I've already got set out. And now we just need to take these and we need to move them over to our ADSR class now. And we can see how this is really cleaning up the editor now. The editor should be very minimal. So it should really only be displaying the other components that are the children of the editor. You see how short that is now. It's only painting the background black. It's only setting out the components. Everything else is now doing its own job. So now let's go over to this ADSR component. Now we need to set out our dials. And now we just need to make some adjustments on where these dials are actually drawing at. Once again, this is something that I've kind of done some experimentation of before. And this should draw fine. So we see that we have this paint window now. We can just fill this black. And now we see everything is really just doing its own job. It's not doing anything outside of one job. We have the ADSR, its job is to be an envelope. We have the wave thumbnail, its job is to display the wave and be in charge of the drag and drop behavior. Then we have the editor. The editor is just displaying all of these other components. So we can see how that really cleans up things now. And now I'll drop this in. Now we see that's laid out very nicely and neatly. And I can just drag this in. Let's get something like a piano. I'm going to turn the volume down a little bit. Okay. And let's see if our ADSR is working. And so we see the ADSR is working now as well. Let's try with a little bit of less tack. So we see that's working. So that's working just fine. And so I hope that helped a little bit. It's something that I know I had a lot of trouble with when I was learning about some of these concepts. It took me a little while to understand how to pass the data back kind of down to your subclasses. And so, yeah, I hope it was helpful for you. And if you liked it, give it a thumbs up, and I will see you for the next tutorial.